Thank you for giving me this chance of presenting my work here. So this is based on the research I've been doing on understanding kind of methodological issues related to the research on children's understanding of the concept of belief. So the research in developmental psychology about the false belief task. But what I would like to do today instead is addressing the question about what are mental states. Okay, so I'm trying to work instead on the pre-theoretical assumptions behind the kind of research I've been following for most of the time. And I call those assumptions pre-theoretical because they are not directly targeted by psychologists while they are doing their research, but they're nevertheless relevant for that because they inform us about the background assumptions they have about how to interpret their results. These assumptions, we might call them really philosophical because they have been the target of a lot of philosophical discussion as well. And they are intuitive in some sense because they are never discussed in the studies by psychologists, and there is a relevant movement of people who are in agreement with them in the philosophy of mind. So they are kind of intuitive, not because they are granted, but because there is a lot of consensus in both the philosophical and the psychological community about the fact that they are granted. So the goal of this talk instead is to ground the basis, provide the basis for a sociocultural constructivist framework about the evolution and the development of social understanding. This is I would like really to give a sketch of such a kind of sociocultural constructivist framework. Okay, let's start from what we have at present. It is kind of received view about false psychology in the philosophy of mind. I want to say really that there is some kind of consensus about interwoven conceptions of the mind that play a role in the ontology, in the semantics of the propositional attitudes, and in the way that we conceive how we know about others' mental states. So, as to the ontology, the traditional assumption or the received view in the philosophy of mind about false psychology is a realistic view. A view that mental states that correspond to or supervene on brain states or things like behavioral dispositions, and they are identified by their representational content, that is the causal contribution that mental states provide to the production of behavior. With respect to the semantics of propositional attitudes, the received view manifests itself in a kind of descriptivism or pictorialist perspective. That is the idea what Quines called the myth of the museum, that the lexicon of false psychology has a descriptive value. So it targets the propositional attitudes, they target particular relational properties in the world. If Marco thinks there is beer in the fridge, for example, this propositional attitude refers to a complex state of affairs in the world where we have a relation between an agent, Marco, and a mental state that is the belief that there is beer in the fridge. And that belief is more or less accurate depending on whether it is a fact that there is beer in the fridge. But the point here is that since it is considered that mental states they identify natural kinds, then it is easily also to assume that the lexicon of false psychology just tracks these occurrences of physical states in the world. Finally, in the epistemology, the received view manifests itself with the assumption that just because we said that propositional attitudes identifies natural relations between a subject and a mental content, therefore it is ascribing a mental state that is knowing about others' mental states just requires identifying such kind of complex relations that one can perceive in the world. There have been different proposals about how we do that. So some philosophers stay with the theory, and they think that identifying these relations is a matter of making theoretical inferences. There have been debate about whether this instead involves direct perception. The simulation theory can stand a bit in between the two. But it is a more complex thing. I don't want to deal with this discussion here. But the point is that such a view of the epistemology of mental states, about how do we know about mental states, or also translated in a kind of naturalized epistemology, that is the capacity to ascribe mental states to others, what is usually called mind reading, is also a biological capacity and has been evolved because it has mainly a predictive function. So here idea is that there are some cases of false psychological reasoning that we are deploying in everyday life. Like in this case, a mother is trying to walk across the street with a child, and they see a car approaching, therefore the reasons in the way something like that. They would think, well, the driver saw us, the driver knows we are here, the driver does not intend to run over us, therefore we can conclude the driver will stop the car, and this allows them to cross the road. So the idea is that ascribing mental states has a predictive function, and it is specifically because of such a function that the capacity to ascribe mental states has been selected through the course of natural evolution. So in some sense, the received view proposes a tightly connected set of assumptions about the nature of mental states. How do we have to interpret propositional attitudes, that is, verbal reports of mental states, and about what is the function of false psychology. And this received view has informed the second point of method, that is research in developmental psychology. Here, the proposal about how do we mind read, that is, how do we ascribe mental states to others, have been different. According to a first branch of psychologists, we have inherited a mental module to ascribe mental states to others. For example, René Baillargeon, one of the champions of this view, she writes, infant ability to infer and reason about others' mental states depends on a content-rich, adaptive neurocomputational system that begins to operate early in life. Here, the assumption is really that mind reading is a modular capacity. And Peter Carruthers, another champion of nativism, argues that the awareness of mental states of other people emerges first in the ontogeny and is likely to be an adaptation that evolved to undergird human ape or primate social life. So, nativist modularist view, they assume that cognitive development already provides us with innate concepts of mental states, and this has been selected in the course of human evolution. Opposed to this, we have rational empiricism by researchers such as Henry Wellman and Alison Gopnik, and they say that children, they don't have specific capacity to ascribe mental states, but they are progressively constructing their capacity to understanding other minds, in the same way in which scientists are doing this. So, for example, Wellman writes, children's early conceptions of the minds are also implicit theories, and changing those conceptions are theoretical changes. So the idea is that children in the first years of their life, they reconstruct their understanding of the minds by a process of theory construction and revision. So there is nothing innate, it's all depending on how children are manipulating and reassessing their own experience of the social life. This view has been recently opposed and expanded by Cecilia Hayes in the book Cognitive Gadgets, where she proposes that children are not doing this process alone, but they are working together with the adults for constructing their understanding of the mind, so that they are exploiting some kind of relevant information and structured content that is not revised by them, as Henry Wellman would say, but it's something that they inherit by the social environment. So, for example, in an article by 2014, Hayes wrote with Chris Frith that our culturally evolutionary views suggest that the ideas about the mind are derived primarily not from the observation, but from instruction, from what the novice is told about the mind by the expert mind readers in her social world. So children are not like small, little scientists who are reconstructing their theories about the functioning of the mind. They inherit these theories by the social environment. So it seems that these reviews, they propose very different understanding of the mechanism about how children develop their social understanding in developmental psychology. And I want to stress, so the divide between the nativist and the Empiricist view is about whether mental state concepts are innate or they are acquired. And the divide between the empiricist view and the constructivist view by Celia Hayes depends on whether the impact of the social stimulation on children's understanding of acquisition of their mind reading capacities. So whether this depends on their own reconstruction of the world or whether they are introduced to this by the curve giver. But in some sense, all these views, they all presuppose the received view, okay, that still mental states are natural entities in the world, and that the problem of the child is to get in contact with the mental states of the others. So even Celia Hayes, who has the most constructivist approach about mind reading in developmental psychology, they say, well, in many respects, the capacity to read minds is like the capacity to read print. So you might think it's a kind of a social capacity, okay? But the cultural evolution account of mind reading does not imply that mental states are mere fictions. So even for Celia Hayes, mental states are a reality of the outer world. They're not constructed through social practices. It's just a child that is exploiting some social practices that they are implemented by the social community. The child is exploiting those practices in order to start mind reading, to start ascribing mental states to others. So here instead, I want to propose a very different view, that is that the received view has some flaws, and I want to explain what are the consequences of rejecting the received view in philosophy, what are the consequences for that in developmental psychology. So first, I would like to introduce some reflection on the pragmatic functions of the default psychological discourse. Well, already Wittgenstein and Sellers, they had substantial arguments demonstrating, according to it, that the full psychological lexicon does not really target internal entities, but has some more relevant functions for the social world. So suppose that Andy and Barbara are talking about what to do in the night, and Andy, for example, can propose, well, I will go to the Indian restaurant. This is really not a proposal, it's just a statement about what he's going to do. Since they are discussing about what to do together, this is very different. Saying I will go to the Indian restaurant is very different from saying something like I intend to go to the Indian restaurant. The first is a statement, it opens no possibility of negotiation of the plan. The second instead allows Barbara to reply and provide her preferences so that they can discuss whether to go. So the point I want to stress here is that by expressing our mental states, in this case intentions, we do that in the context of negotiating shared plans for action. And beliefs and reports of beliefs and knowledge is also relevant for this kind of social practice. So for example, if Barbara says, well, the Indian restaurant is closed, this really impacts the plan to go to the Indian restaurant tonight, but at the same time, place a burden on Barbara for the fact that she committed herself to the fact that the Indian restaurant is closed. So if they later discover that the Indian restaurant is open, Barbara will be blamed for that. So by stating things like, I believe that the Indian restaurant is closed, Barbara is making the same exactly contribution about providing content to the conversation. Therefore, by suggesting that they should go to some other place rather than the Indian restaurant. At the same time, she also takes a hedge. She is defending herself from being blamed for providing wrong information in the case it is later discovered the restaurant is opened. So the general point is that the expression of mental states also allow us to express pragmatic commitments towards actions, and that this expression is fundamental to the social practices of creating, sharing, and negotiating joint plans. Now, here we also see some kind of interesting property, because pragmatic commitments, similarly to mental states, they possess correctness conditions, and they are normatively associated to behavior, because if I'm pragmatically committing myself to perform some action later in the future, then I'm presupposed to do that action in the future, okay? But differently from mental states, the kind of necessity of normativity that is associated with pragmatic commitments is not causal, but is more related to moral responsibility. So that if people are not acting in agreement with their commitments, then they can be blamed or they can feel guilty for that. So it's a moral responsibility, it's not a causal necessity that forces us to respect our pragmatic commitments. And at the same time, pragmatic commitments, differently from mental states, they are intersubjective and they are scrutable by the social community. So I think this engenders an interesting question that is it possible that the lexicon of thought psychology originated to express such pragmatic commitments rather than to target internal states that are private and that are not intersubjective? So the view I would like to defend is the view that is put very clearly in place by the word of Martin Kusch. He says it is because culture shapes our body that it shapes our brains. And it is because culture shapes our brain that at least some mental states of the brain, at least some states of the brain might well be called social states. They are social because they are real artifacts of our culture. So the proposal here is that mental states, against the received view, might be not natural entities, but they may be social constructions. And if that is the case, it also follows that mind reading, that is the capacity to ascribe mental states, is a social cultural capacity. Okay, so the proposal is that mind reading depends on a social linguistic practice at its bottom. It has been selected through cultural evolution and really has the function of tracking the pragmatic commitments that people assume while creating, sharing, and negotiating joint plans. I can already anticipate what I think are very relevant, very promising properties of such a kind of an account about mind reading and mental states. Suppose this refers to an example about collective intentionality. So suppose that Elon Musk says that SpaceX intends to bring men on Mars before 2026. Here, Musk is using a mental lexicon, and it is a semantic problem about how to interpret it. Because the first assumption might be, well, we have to assume that intentions refers to the intentions of Elon Musk, okay? But this is not a very satisfying reading because it forces us to translate an ascription to SpaceX on an ascription of a mental state from SpaceX on a particular subject, that is the director. So the other view that generated a lot of debate in the philosophy of action and mind is to take this ascription as a description of a collective mental state. So it is SpaceX as an agency that has the intention of bringing men to Mars before 2026. And this opened a lot of discussion about what is the kind of intentionality related to collective agents. But there is a very promising view as well that is coherent with the proposal I was advancing. That is, by saying SpaceX intends to bring men on Mars before 2026, Elon Musk is saying nothing but that SpaceX has a pragmatic commitment to make through a state of affairs that is in 2026 men will be on Mars. So this is it is an interpretation that does not force any particular assumption or strange interpretation of the words, but still is very coherent and gives us an idea of why we use a mental lexicon, not only in case of individual agents, but also in the case of collective agents. So I think this is a kind of very promising project to identify the pragmatic functions of mental states reports in everyday conversation and to try to see whether they are more basic or more advanced pragmatic functions between these everyday contexts. Okay. For example, referring to an article by Van Cleef and Gawker, they discuss 6 possible functions of ascribing beliefs in conversation, going from the simpler to the more complex one. The first one is the expressive attribution of belief. It is the same use of I think, that, I explained or discussed an example of Andy and Barbara. So it's just to use as think before an express a sentence, just to put a modal operator of uncertainty before the sentence. Second use is the repetition of expressive attributions of beliefs. So if I say I use I think as a hedge for what I'm saying, it is also possible that another person reports my belief just because she repeats my words, but without having no understanding at all of what's behind that, what is the kind of mental states that informs my words. The third use that they discuss is the indirect discourse attribution of belief. So sometimes I might paraphrase what another person is saying. So I don't report the literal words, but I make a synthesis. And so I use I believe rather than saying, because I'm not directly reporting her speech, but because I'm just paraphrasing what was the gist of the speech. The fourth concept is the fact that by these paraphrases, sometimes we can also introduce some other thoughts that were not explicitly expressed by the person we are paraphrasing, but that they are illogical consequences of the thought that she expressed and that we ascribe to the person. And finally, there are the explanatory attributions of beliefs when we are reporting beliefs to explain ours or others' behavior, and the predictive attributions of belief, the cases that are taken as to be the pragmatic cases by the supporters of the received view that look at thought psychology as a predictive theory at its core. Okay, so I think that this is just, so I'm not committing myself to this particular reconstruction, but here you can see that there are different uses, pragmatic functions of description of mental states, and these uses are becoming more and more complex as long as we go deep into the hierarchy. So the project that I think is kind of interesting is that once we identify different functions of the description of mental states in everyday lexicon, in everyday social conversation, we can identify some uses that are more complex than others, and then we can maybe provide a plausible description of children acquisitions of such uses that does not presuppose the fact that children have an innate capacity or a constructed capacity to understand mental states. Rather, the mind reading capacity may be built upon their mastery of these linguistic uses. And this proposal, of course, also translates in the domain of the evolution of mind reading. So it will be important also to provide a plausible story of the evolution of the thought psychological lexicon. So to get to this kind of project, I have been discussing the kind of evolutionary part in a few articles that were published in 2017, and the last one with Tad Sawicki in 2020 on synthese. The idea here is our linguistic practices. This article really makes justice of the idea of mind shaping, elaborated by Tad Sawicki. So the idea that with our social practices, we are contributing to write the mind, to shape the minds of the others, so that thought psychology, the lexicon of thought psychology has a predictive function, but this is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It is because we are shaping our minds to respect the norms and standards of thought psychology that in the end, thought psychology has a predictive function. But for today's talk, I would like instead to focus on the other point of the project, that is on showing how this view about the nature of mental states translates into interesting reflection on how children acquire the lexicon of thought psychology and acquire the understanding of mental concepts. This is based on an article published in 2021 on phenomenology and the cognitive sciences. So the basis for that is the sociopragmatic linguistic view about linguistics. That is the idea that language is a tool for communication and social interaction. So by languaging, by speaking, we do things, okay? So this is a view that is opposed to the pictorialist view about language that focuses that comes from model theoretic semantics and focuses on the fact that language is a tool to represent the word and to refer to the word. Now, such a view, such a action view about language translates into important assumptions about the nature of semantic and conceptual understanding. As to semantic understanding, it means that children's participation in routinized social activities would give us scaffolds and shapes their learning of the word meanings. Understanding word meanings is not something that children are doing alone by realizing what is the referent of particular words. And this is actually how the problem of learning a language is often posed by developmental psychologists. Instead, learning a language is really a gradual process that unfolds as children progressively attune their capacity to use and to react to the use of an expression to socially shared behavioral and linguistic standards. Okay, so learning a language is nothing but mastering the linguistic practices of the community that uses that language. It is important that within this view, conceptual understanding is also a gradual process that takes the same path. That is, it depends on the kind of social interaction that is provided to the child and the complexity of the social interaction that is provided to the child. Such complexity progressively scaffold the child's capacity to understand her reality and also her social reality. And second, again, conceptual understanding is a gradual process. It's not something that comes all together and that there is a eureka moment when the child acquires a particular concept. Acquisition of concept is something that develops through time as the child practices, masteries the norms, the linguistic norms of the social environment, but also the social practices that are occurring in the social environment. So we can see how this kind of account is informative about learning of mental state words, opposed to the view that the pictorialist view that requires children to map words to internal mental states and to the mental states of the others. So, for example, there is an interesting analysis of how children acquire the use of the verb want by Nancy Woodward. She says, well, first, we can imagine that children, infants, they are naturally propended to manifest their dispositions. For example, they are interested in an object that they would like to reach. In the cases in which they cannot reach for that object, they might equally stretch their arms toward the object, thereby triggering a helping response from the caregiver. There's kind of interesting work showing that the pointing in humans may really be nothing more than this. It is reinforced as a behavior of the infant because the caregiver brings close to the child the objects that the child is trying to reach even when they are not at close distance. So the first uses of want might be really nothing more than the abstraction of such a practice to the verbal domain. When the child says, I want this, I want that, the child is not doing anything else from pointing at the object with words rather than with the arms in order to have the object. And in fact, if that was the case, the child would need to understand nothing of desires as internal states in order to use want effectively. What is relevant is that those uses of want would all be connected to the use of objects rather than verbs in the action. So they will all be something like, I want this, I want that, but it would never express the child a sentence like, I want to go, or I want you to come, and things like that. In fact, reality is like that. That is, children first are mastering these uses, and later they start mastering other uses of desire talk to express, for example, permission. Do you want me to do this? And therefore, from the permission, also to express requests. I want to put this there as a way of asking for expressing what they're going to do. So the proposal by Nancy Woodward is that children progressively structure the understanding of desires, not because they are mapping desires on their internal states, but because they progressively master new pragmatic functions of the reports of desires in everyday conversation. there is kind of interesting data also on the mastering of thinking and belief verbs. So this comes from a study by Discursive and Tomasello. And by the way, I want to say that it's not easy to find those studies because the theoretical assumption, as I was saying at the start, that are behind these studies are very different from the standard received view in much of developmental psychology. That is also based on the received view in philosophy. And so, because the theoretical framework behind the research does not stress the relevance of the social environment on learning the meaning of mental state verbs, as a consequence, much research about children's acquisition of the meaning of mental state verbs is performed within the pictorialist view about language, and refers to pragmatic cases and methodologies where children are required to map the use of the words on a particular state of affairs that instance that mental state. So the kind of lack of alternatives in terms of theoretical frameworks produces a strong agreement on particular methodologies that are overlooking the role of the social context for children's acquisition of the meaning of words. So instead, these studies by Discursive and Tomasello, who are also working within an action-based view of language, they noticed that complement-taking verb clauses within English sentences and complement constructions possess at least 3 distinct uses. Okay, there is an assertive use, that is the classical view of reporting propositional attitudes, such as Sally thought that he was crazy, where you have 2 sentences, 2 actors, and the content of the thought that is ascribed to Sally is really relevant to describe the kind of situation that is expressed by the propositional attitude. In performative use, one sometimes can use a propositional attitude, like if I say, I believe that these conditions are fair, but I'm expressing a belief, this is a belief of mine, but at the same time, the main reason why I'm doing this is because I'm trying to negotiate or coordinate my interaction with my conversational partner. And then there are kind of uses that they call formulaic, like these conditions are fair. I think here, I think is really perceived as a kind of model operator, but there is not an expression of a propositional attitude at all. So their hypothesis before the study was that children might master formulaic uses before performative and performative before assertive. And in the experiments that they performed, they found exactly that the first usage of mental state verbs by children are always in the first person, they are always formulaic, and only later children start mastering mental state verbs like I think to express more complex state of affairs related to the assertive uses. Just to show a short example of why this is relevant, but for example, you can take, this is the in the knowledge access task. It is a traditional test that is used in developmental psychology to see whether a child understands or not how other agents might ignore some piece of information. The task proceeds as follows. The child is shown a box with a closed drawer containing a toy and is asked what she thinks is inside. So the drawer next is open and the child is shown that it contains something like, for example, a plastic doll. Then a puppet is shown to the child. The puppet is called Polly, let's say, and the child is told, Polly has never seen inside the drawer. Now here comes Polly. So does Polly know what is inside the drawer? And of course, in order to pass the task, the child has to say that Polly doesn't know because she didn't see what it was inside the drawer. The point is that these tasks with the word on Wellham and Liu are usually taken to demonstrate that children understand ignorance, okay? So that it is a kind of conceptual understanding that other agents might ignore information. That's what is proven by the task. But if you locate this task within the action-based account of language, and the sociopragmatic view on linguistics that I have been describing just a few moments before, you can see that the input that the child receives in the task is a verbal input. That is, Polly has never seen inside the drawer. Does she know what is in the drawer? Okay, so we can really say that the task might be not about testing children's conceptual understanding of ignorance, but might be about checking children's semantic understanding of a particular pragmatic function of the verb to know. That is, the fact that we can ascribe knowledge or ignorance in a specific context, depending on whether an agent had or not a perceptual interaction with the scene. So if we'll focus on the second perspective, children passing the task does not indicate that they understand ignorance as a private mental state of an agent, but still manifests that they master some particular uses of the verb know in the context of shared interaction. So I think this is enough to claim that there is much work to do in developmental psychology about branding children's acquisition of social understanding into more into their linguistic capacities, and not in over-interpreting their linguistic performance in a particular task in terms of conceptual understanding. In the article shown before by 2021 on phenomenology and the cognitive science, I argued how this view impacts research on children acquisition of the capacity to pass the false belief task. And here we are at my conclusions. I know that these are kind of just being gesturing in favor of them, but I have not been arguing extendedly in favor of them. So these are not definitive argument, although much of my research has been conducted in this framework and partially provide evidence for from developmental psychology for this view. So I have been arguing that mental states are sociocultural constructions serving specific pragmatic functions, and that as a consequence, mind reading is also a social linguistic practice, tracking the pragmatic commitments that people assume while creating, sharing, and negotiating joint plans. I've argued that mind reading may have evolved through cultural evolution, although I just shortly talk about that, and that mind reading instead in infancy is acquired by children in social interaction by progressively mastering the pragmatic functions of full psychological lexicon. I thank you again for this chance of giving this presentation, and thank you for your attention.
So let's start with the discussion. First of all, I would like to remind those who are joining us via Zoom that if you have any questions on the speaker, please enter Q in the chat. And I would like to ask Marco Fenici if we can stop sharing content.
Yes, yes, of course. Okay.
Thank you. The first question in the audience.
Hi, Marco. Thanks for your talk. This is Pietro Salis. I'd like to ask a little clarificatory question concerning your very idea of social constructivism, which is very interesting, by the way. And I think there are two different ways one can entertain in order to develop this idea. And those ways seems to go in different direction. On the one hand, you use the metaphor of mind shaping, for example, and that seems to be particularly strong. Something like we have practices which are very flexible, which can change from place to place, from time to time in a very relevant way. On the other hand, the reference to practice, to pragmatic functions and the like, seems to point much more in the direction of a kind of institutional reality. And so that mental states are in a sense instituted by practice. And so little children are initiated in a sense in the participation in those practices and something like that. How do you see this particular kind of social construction that you have in mind in this proposal? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Pietro. I think it's a nice remark. I definitely have in mind, even when I was quoting Martin Kusch, of course, the institutionalized reality. So there is not, well, there is kind of stability in thought psychology that depends on a kind of stability of our social practices overall as a human species. And this has been reinforced over the course of time. So our practices are kind of instituting the way we talk about mental states. But I think that maybe we can look at the two different concepts you identified of constructivism as a kind of temporal, on a temporal relation, so that the mind-shaping practice might be something that is more open to variation, but that really started the possibility for us to introduce thought psychological lexicon in our linguistic practices, and later this lexicon has been institutionalized, and it is preserved through kind of socially agreed social agreement on the particular uses of that lexicon.
Okay, I see there is a question by Jaakko Reinikainen.
Okay, thank you much for the talk. I was wondering, you didn't say is your approach of the alternative functional explanation of thought psychology and mental state lexicon, how is it in any way incompatible with the sort of alternative or standing accounts of the functional explanations? So could it be that folk lexicon, for example, simply has both functions, both the pragmatic, a function of producing pragmatic commitments and describing these psychologically real or mental states? So is it even meant to displace or be incompatible with the existing accounts?
Well, this is a kind of ontological view about the role between language and reality. I've never thought expressly about that, but my general take is that we can look at the descriptive function of lexicon as a derivative function from its pragmatic function. At least from a pragmatic view, we are born within a social community. We learn to talk about language, to use language in our social practices from the start. So the community is already there. The pragmatic functions is the most fundamental one. Among the possible uses of language, as Wittgenstein would have said, there are also the descriptive view uses, but these are just one of the many tools that are for us in the among the possibility that are offered to us by using language.
Okay, thanks.
Is that I mean, does that reply or?
Well, well, yeah. So I take it that you accept that the two functions are compatible, that so that the lexicon can have both functions, and the question is which is more primary in the evolutionary sense or explanatory sense.
Yes, yeah, I'm more concerned with the fact that taking the descriptivist view as a primary view has a strong impact in research in developmental psychology, and overrides the important pragmatic functions that lexicon plays for us in general. And in the case of mental states, it creates a kind of myth that we have innate mental states, because otherwise it would be impossible to start having social interaction at first. So I think I'm more concerned in the implications of the descriptive functions in developmental psychology.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, it seems we have run out of time, so I would like to thank our speaker again.
Thank you very much.